Well, hello. My name is Tad Neilson, and I am the oldest son of Virgil and Lenore Neilson. And this video is one that I have that has kind of a history behind it. All of the pictures, the videos that were taken in this compilation were taken by my dad. A lot of the early ones, he never owned a camera himself until I was probably a teenager. But my Uncle Stan had a video camera, and so he would borrow Uncle Stan's camera. And some of the earlier videos in this series are from that he used Uncle Stan's camera. And later, Dad would get his own camera, and I kind of comment on that as we go through the video. But the camera that they used little 3-inch reels, and so you could only get maybe 10-15 minutes of a video shot on any one reel. And so for years we had all these little 3-inch reels in a box kind of sitting around the house, and I think Jennifer ended up with the little reels themselves. And finally Jennifer took all those reels and projected them on the wall and videoed those old pictures off of the wall and put them on a VHS video, and she made copies of that and gave to all of us siblings, which, she hadn't done that, I don't know if we would have gotten these videos put together like that. But anyway, I took my copy and digitized it, put it on in digital format. And as I was going through that the other day, I thought, my children or my grandchildren who might look at this, they may pick out me and their mom, or they may pick out grandpa and grandma or whatever. But so many of the individuals in this video, they would never know who they were. And a lot of the things that we were doing when these pictures were taken, there's really no explanation behind it. So I took the video and have edited it and added comments like this in different places. And also as I went through, as you watch it, you'll see little names pop up. And so I've tried to identify the individual that you're seeing in the video, and then have made comments as you go through it as to what's going on, and maybe some of the stories behind what you're seeing. So hopefully I've edited this to the point where my descendants can look at it and kind of understand what's going on and who it is they're watching. So the folks, when they were first married, they started out in Egan Bench, and I'll actually show you a picture of their very first home here in just a minute. But they started out on what's called the Egan Bench, which is actually straight north of Rexburg and straight west of St. Anthony. There's a Parker and Egan are right in that area, and the folks lived just a mile south of my dad's parents, Otto and Orabelle Neilson. And they lived there until I was probably 4 or 5 years old, I think. They lived there. And Dad had a little farm that he bought from Grandpa. And he actually got into the dairy business. He built him a really nice dairy barn, which at the time was really state-of-the-art dairy, and was doing real well. They about the time I was 4 or 5 years old, southern Idaho, down around Rupert, uh, began to develop, and that's because they discovered the aquifers under the ground, and discovered that they could use large electric pumps to pump the water to the surface to irrigate crops with. And so Dad and Uncle Stan were one of the very first, to move down into that area and break ground out of sagebrush and to establish irrigation farms down there. And both Dad and Uncle Stan put in some of the first sprinkler irrigated farms in that Minidoka County down there. So that's kind of so some of the videos here will start when they lived in Rupert. After they got the land on the north side of Minidoka County, and they lived in Rupert for a few years, and then finally moved out to the farm, and then they moved from basically one farm to another for different reasons that I'll kind of explain as we go through here. But they, like I say, they started in Egan, moved to Rupert, and then moved out to the desert on the farm out there. So there were eight of us siblings born to our parents, and our oldest, the firstborn, Steve, only lived a couple of days and passed away. And the rest of us, there's myself, Tad, and then my siblings, Patsy, David, Mark, Julie, Jennifer, and Sonia. I think that's all of us. And so I've tried to identify us as we show up in these videos as well. I have to say that our growing up was, in my mind, an absolutely idyllic childhood. Absolutely idyllic childhood. I don't know how my siblings and I could possibly have had a more amazing childhood and early growing up years than we had. We had two parents who absolutely adored and loved each other, and we had the gospel of Jesus Christ in our homes from the very beginning. And it's interesting, as I talked to my dad years later, he talked about Mom and what kind of an impact she actually had on him as far as the church is concerned. He was a member. He was always a member. His mother Grandma Orabelle has a long history of her progenitors being in the church, actually coming from Nauvoo across the plains. Grandpa Neilson joined the church later after they were married. But my dad, he was in the church and he loved the gospel, but my mom had an impact on my dad and his faithfulness in the gospel, and I, he would even have admitted that he was who he was because of our mother and her. I mean, the gospel was everything. In fact, she used to come up to me, and she'd take her hands and put them on the side of my face like this, and she'd pull me in just nose to nose. And she would look at me and she'd say, "Tad, the gospel is everything." And I'll never forget that as long as I live, having my mom do that to me. She did it several times. But anyway, we to be able to have parents like that, to have the gospel in our home, and then to be raised in an agricultural setting with all that entailed, farm and crops and animals and rain and hail and dependency upon the Lord for your crops and just all of that. we had animals. I had a horse of my own for several years, and my dad gave me a 20 gauge shotgun when I was 12 years old for my 12th birthday. So there's just things like this that I look back on and I think, how many kids in the world had the opportunity to have that kind of a childhood, that kind of a bringing up. But anyway, it was pretty special, and so I'm excited to share these videos with you. A lot of stories about where we're at I have in my own personal history, so you may have to go to those to get some of the stories, because a lot of what's in here I've covered in my personal history as well. But these videos are priceless, and I hope that my posterity enjoys them. So here we go. So this is Egan Bench. So this little home here, I think I have a couple other pictures of it in some of my other history. But this little home here is the first home that our parents lived in. And this is where I was born. I and Patsy were born here in this home. And in fact, David, the three of us were born. So the three of us were born while we lived here. And this little house, if you look way in the background to the right of that little house, you'll see a little clump of trees right on the horizon. This little house used to be way back there. And Dad bought this little piece of ground here that he farmed, and the little house he bought from the neighbors, and towed that house from where those trees are in the background down to this location, which is just maybe a half mile south of where my grandparents, Orabelle and Otto Neilson lived. And so this is the house, and it's right near this house that Dad built that milking parlor that I told you about. This was their first house. When Mom and Dad moved from the Egan Bench area, from St. Anthony, down to Rupert, they moved down there because Dad was, like I said earlier, was one of the first to get in on the new reclamation project north of Rupert. And when they first moved there, they lived in this little white house south of Rupert on 117 South 5th Street, 117 South 5th Street in Rupert. And in 2007, we took Dad back to Rupert to visit some of his old hangouts, and visited this little house. The carport on the left side was not there. Of course, the chain link fence was not there. There was a little wooden fence that was there that you'll see in some of the pictures coming up here. But this was where they first lived. What I remember about this little house is, number one, I remember the Christmases in this house, and I couldn't believe how many toys Santa Claus brought us for Christmas. But this is a tiny little house. And the other thing I remember is in the back, along the fence line, Mom grew irises. And I always thought those irises were the most beautiful things I'd ever seen. Along the back of the house, and the little fence that was down the right side of the property there. Beautiful little place. And I remember those irises. The other thing I remember in this little house is we had a puppy. Mom and Dad got us a little puppy, and they got it, brought it home. We fed it milk, and it just did not do well. But we only had it about 2 days, and that little puppy died. And I will never forget the impact that had on me. That there was this lovely little puppy, and Now it's dead. And I'll never forget that. But this was a sweet little, oh, I could go on forever. But I also had one of the worst experiences probably of my life. I had a friend named Kirk Hodges, and they lived about 3 houses to the left of where this little house was. And Kirk got a fire engine, a toy fire engine that I really, really liked. And mom and dad, we were home, and I think they had slipped to the grocery store or something. But I went down to the Hodges house, and nobody ever locked their doors back then. But I went in their house, and I went in Kirk Hodges' bedroom, and I picked up that little fire engine truck and took it home because I wanted it. And Mrs. Hodges came to my mom and asked, no, in fact, I think Mom saw the fire engine, and she went to she asked me where I got it, and I told her, and so she went to Mrs. Hodges and told her, and took the truck back, had me take the truck back, and Mrs. Hodges was really kind of put out, which I probably would have been too, but she said, your son is a thief. He's a thief. And I remember Mom sitting me down after that and saying, Ted, do you know what it means to steal? Do you know what it means to steal? And I said, no. And so she explained to me what it meant to steal something. And I'll never forget that. But that little house has a lot of memories. It was about 2 years after Mom and Dad moved into the after they moved into the little house on 14th Street that Dad, he had been traveling back and forth from town all the way out to the farm, which was about, oh gosh, out to that farm would have been probably 20 miles, close to 20 miles. But they decided to build a house out on the farm and to move the family out of the city to the farm. Dad built this little cinder block house that you see here in about 1955. Our neighbor across the street, Brother Breger, was owned a cement company, and his home actually, he built his home across the street from the little White House there on 5th Street. But Brother Brager came out and helped Dad get started with his house, and Dad laid almost all of the brickwork on this little house. Years later, when he was about 82 years old, Cass and I took him to visit that little place, and he looked at that, and he was so proud of the brickwork that after all these years, the brickwork looked so nice. It hadn't cracked. It looked really good. And he stepped back and he looked at the roof line on that little house, and he says, "Look at that roof." He says, "It's still straight." And you looked at that roof, and it had not sagged 1 inch. And he was so proud of that. There on the sprinkler place, so I'd been about 57, probably about 1957, 58, right in there, 56 maybe. But there were 2 years in a row that they had real harsh winters, and the fall came early and was really wet. And a combination of all that caused Dad to basically lose his crops on the sprinkler place 2 years in a row. And so as a result of all that, he was forced to sell that farm, and he bought a nearby ground that was still in sagebrush, naturally, which we called the Hodges place, because eventually we sold it to Brother Hodges. But he again cleared that farm of sagebrush, and he farmed it for about 2 years. Interesting little story I have to tell here about Dad, but years later, when I was in seminary, my seminary teacher was a brother who used to be in the stake presidency, and I don't even know what brought it up or anything, but he made a comment about Dad. He said, "The one thing that I know about your dad is that he was a full tithe payer." And I thought that was really strange to come from my seminary teacher, but my dad, even going through all that he went through and losing those crops for those 2 years, that he would be known by the brethren in the area as a full tithe payer. And I thought that was remarkable. But anyway, he farmed that place for about 2 years. That was the Hodges place. And then another opportunity came available. The federal government in 1959 opened up several thousand acres of desert land for homesteading. And Dad was fortunate enough to be drawn for one of those homes, and that was quite a deal. I remember the drawing was held in downtown Rupert at the little square, and Dad had put his name in a little pill capsule about that big and put it in that vat with literally thousands of other people who wanted to get those farms. And we were at the Bregers' home listening to the radio, and I'll be darned if Dad's name wasn't drawn and read over the radio. And oh my goodness, the hooting and the hollering that took place when Mom and Dad heard their name on the radio. It was really quite an event. And but the farms were in sagebrush, and you would select each one was numbered, and I forget what number that Dad was. I could find that. I've got that someplace. But it was numbered, and so they would go down sequentially down those numbers, and each person would then have the opportunity to select a farm in that order. And so Dad selected the farm that we now have as the Smith place. And we called it the Smith place because eventually we sold it to Brother Smith, who was one of our neighbors. But yeah, this was a real blessing to the folks. One of the requirements to taking a homestead was that you had to build a dwelling on there, and you had to build it within the first, I think, year. You had to build a dwelling. Dad wasn't in a position to build a house, so he built this barn, and this building you see here is the barn that he built, and it was set up so that we had a little kitchen, tiny little living room area, and then a bedroom for Mom and Dad downstairs, and then upstairs in the unfinished attic with open rafters was where us kids slept, and we slept on the floor in sleeping bags, and that was really fun for us kids to do, especially in the winter. We didn't have a door on the attic. We just had a blanket over the door, and we slept up there in the winter in that attic. I remember the cats getting inside our sleeping bags and going down to the bottom and curling up around our feet, and how nice and warm it was to have those cats in those sleeping bags. But this was our home here, this little barn house. So this picture here is Dad, and I think that's Julie in that picture. I've looked at that 1,000 times trying to figure it out, but I think it's Julie. I thought it was Mark at first, but I think that's Julie with Dad. But if you look at that picture, just above Dad's head, to the left of the barn, you'll see a gate. There's a gate there. There's part of the corrals and the fence around the corrals. Dad built that gate about 62 years ago, and when we drove there to visit that area, we walked over there, and Dad stood by that gate, and he just kind of chuckled, and he's inspecting that gate, and even to this day, even though the wood is so deteriorated, as you can see in the picture, the gate hung square and straight on the same pintles that Dad hung them on, and that doesn't happen very often with gates. I've put up enough gates to know that. But he laughed with pride when he saw that old gate still hanging there. So eventually, there on the Smith place, Dad, it was about probably a year and a half, maybe 2 years after he built the barn. Dad built this little home that you see here in this picture, and he did most of the work on that again himself. I remember there were a couple of times that were some guys that came to help him do some of the carpentry, but I remember him walking around up on the ceiling and doing the rafters up there, and I remember him laying a lot of the brick around that home. But he built this for Mom, and actually, if you look in that picture, you can see Dad just barely on the right side of that picture, and he's 82 years old in this picture. The one thing that's funny about that home is Mom, I remember her lamenting that they had to pay $12,000 to build that house. She could not hardly believe that they had to spend that much money to build that little house. $12,000. Can you imagine? Oh my goodness, you can't even buy a used car for that anymore. But yeah, I remember her mentioning that to her one time, and she laughed. Yeah, $12,000. Okay, so a little story I've got to tell you here. When we lived on the Smith place, on one occasion, Mom and Dad went to town and left us kids at home alone. And of course, we were older, but they left us home alone. But for whatever reason, Patsy and I got into a really bad argument. I don't even remember what it was about, but I remember we got into a real bad argument. We didn't throw punches or anything, but we were yelling at each other pretty bad. When Mom and Dad got home, the other kids told on us, and they told the folks that it was Tad's fault, which it was. It was my fault. Well, Dad wasn't going to have any of that, and so he took me into the back bedroom, into Mom and Dad's bedroom, and he took his belt off, and I could still see him taking that belt off. That was a sight that we witnessed more than once, of Dad taking his belt off. But he took his belt off because he was going to give me a spanking, going to give me a whipping. And at that moment, just before he spanked me, Patsy came running into the bedroom crying. And she says, "No, Daddy, don't spank him. Spank me instead." Well, that touched Dad so deeply that he didn't spank either one of us. And I've thought back on that little act of love that Patsy exhibited for me, and it has endeared her to me my entire life. Such a sweet thing for her to do, and so typical of Patsy's personality. Okay, I'm going to jump in here and just make a comment or two about um, working on the farm, and especially these pictures here are of us kids, mainly David, Mark, and I, hauling hay. But we were Dad's farm hands, and actually we loved it. There's only one time that I remember resenting having to do so much work on the farm, and I think I mentioned that in my personal history. But we felt it an honor to be part of Dad's operation, and the fact that he trusted us as much as he did there on the farm. When it came to hay hauling and bringing in the harvest, that's really kind of when I thought back on it, I was amazed at how much work we did in the hay fields. Dad would usually raise anywhere from 80 to 100 acres of hay each year. He had his own cows and horses to feed, and he would sell some hay. I don't even remember what hay prices were back then, but he would with 80 to 100 acres, he would usually get on average about 2 ton of hay an acre, and each year you would get 3 harvests of hay. So you get three separate cuttings of hay. So that gives you a total of about, for 100 acres, that's about 600 ton of hay each year. And we would lift each bale of hay about 3 times. And each bale weighed, Dad was pretty careful to try and keep the bales around 80 pounds a piece. Sometimes they'd get a little heavier, and we would know it when those bales would sneak up to 100 pounds. But usually you tried to keep it about 80 pounds. And so we would lift each of those bales 3 times, from the field to the truck, from the truck onto the stack, and then from the stack to feed the cows. Sometimes more than that. You'd have to load it from the stack to the truck to the cows, or stack to the truck to take to town. But generally, we would, each of us, lift every bale about 3 times. So that's about 1,800 ton of hay each year, and this is mainly on the Davis place, and I got to calculating. I was there on that place with them for about 5 years, so the 3 of us hauled hay there for 5 years, and you multiply that out by 5 years. That means us boys lifted 9,000 ton of hay in that 5 years. That's 225,000 of those 80-pound bales, and if you calculate that out, that comes out to 18 million pounds of hay that each of us boys, on average, maybe a little less than that, but not much, but we lifted that much over those 5 years. And so no wonder we all had 6-packs. I'm going to make a comment here as well on these few pictures. This picture here is off in the distance. There's a huge, huge range fire, and this was really quite an event because we walked out there to the edge of the yards and watched that fire, and they had plain tankers carrying in flame retardant and water to put out that fire. But this was several miles to the west of our farm, but it was enormous. It was an enormous fire. And the fear always was, would it get close to the farm? At that time, all of our wheat and barley, was dead ripe. And so we're looking at that fire and thinking, what'll happen if that fire gets close to the farm or jumps from wherever it is to our farm and sets some of that wheat on fire? It would be absolutely disastrous. I had one experience. This was after we were married. Jana and I were married. That we went home to visit the folks, and I had gone down to change some water, move some pipe, and went back to the pump to turn on the pump. Well, when you hit the button on the pump to start the pump, there's a lag time between when you hit the button and when the pump kicks on. So I had pushed that button, and Jan and I had started to walk away, and we were probably 150, 200 yards away when I heard the pump behind me click on. That's right, it clicked on. And then in a few seconds, I heard a sound that sounded like water coming out of a rainbird, just kind of a spritzy sound to me, and which sounded pretty normal. And I happened to turn around and look back at the pump, and what I was hearing was not a rainbird. It was when that pump kicked on, it sparked up at the power line and dropped sparks down into the ripe June grass. And that June grass had caught fire and had started to burn. And what I was hearing was the crackling of that June grass. And at that pump, to the north of the pump was about 80 acres of wheat, and to the south of that pump was about 100 acres of wheat. And next to each of those fields was other huge fields of wheat, not just ours, but the neighbors. When I saw that fire, I panicked. And Jana said she never saw me run so fast. But I ran back there and started kicking and stomping in that June grass to try and get that fire out. And eventually I did. I was able to get that fire out, but I'll tell you, my heart was racing 1,000 miles an hour, because I could see in my mind's eye that June grass jumping into that wheat field of ripe wheat, and losing that entire crop to fire. So this was serious stuff. And so when we saw this range fire out there to the west of the farm, it was concerning. It was concerning. Okay, this is a little incident I wanted to relate the story to. This picture here is David and Mark checking the oil in the old blue Ford truck that had the stock racks on the back of it. This old truck has a story. One afternoon, Dad had dropped the oil out of this truck. It was parked in the shop, and he dropped the oil out of it to change it, and he left the hood up, but he hadn't put the oil back in it. Yeah, but he left the hood up. Anyway, I had gone out and went out. I saw the hood was up. I needed to use the truck, so I slammed the hood down, jumped in the truck, started it up, headed off down the road. I was going to Brother Wixom's farm, which was about 3 miles away from where we lived, and I had done some tractor work for him to try and earn a little money. We never worked off the farm. We always worked. Our work was on the farm, but every once in a while, Dad, 2 or 3 times that I remember, he let me take his tractor and his diesel, and I would go do some farm work for a neighbor, which is what I did for Brother Wixom. And I wanted to go over there and pick up my $25 check from Brother Wixom so I could cash it. But anyway, I got about a quarter mile down the road, and that truck seized up just as solid and skidded to a stop right in the middle of the road. I had burnt up the engine on Dad's truck, and I had to walk home. We didn't have cell phones, so I had to walk home to get Dad. And I've always thought back on that so many times that he never got mad at me. And I really expected him to. I mean, I should have known better when I saw the hood up, but he never got mad at me. All he did was he looked at me and he said, "Well, Tad, that's what you call stepping over dollars to pick up pennies." And I felt about that big. But that was one of the experiences I'll never forget with that old Ford truck. Okay, so here's another little story that I wanted to relate. This is a brand new 250cc Yamaha motorcycle, and David and Mark and I were out. It was in the evening, and we were out milking cows in the little barn. And Dad drives up in his pickup, and he's got this motorcycle lashed into the back of his pickup. And none of us boys we absolutely could not believe that he had done that he had bought that for us. I had been coaxing Dad, hounding him really, for quite some time, telling him that I really wanted a motorcycle. I had friends that had new Honda motorcycles, and it was just one of those things that I just really wanted, really bad. And I actually had conversations with Dad about it, and I remember one especially. He said, Tad, I can't do it. I just don't have the spare money to do that. I just don't have the money for something like that. And at that time, a motorcycle like this, the little 50ccers had just come out, and they were kind of a thing, kind of a fad. And then the bigger ones like this 250 came out, and they were mainly just for cruising, just for riding around. Later, of course, motorcycles became farm hands. I mean, you rode one of those around because it was easy to get around on the farm and everything. But this was not. This was a cruising bike, and that's what I felt like I wanted. And I hounded him for the longest time for that. And but here he came, driving up with that thing in the back of his pickup. And I can just imagine how he felt getting this, for his boys. Something like that. Totally impractical. Really did not have the money for that sort of thing. But he did it for his boys. Years later, I went up to Dad and I said, I am so sorry that I hounded you like I did to buy that stupid motorcycle. I am so sorry. And he looked at me and he says, well, I apologize. I should have bought it for you sooner. Yeah. So this is another little narrated issue I wanted to talk about on here personally. Winters in the little house there on the Davis place were interesting. We never had harsh winters, but we had bad winters, and they could get really cold. And we didn't have a lot of depth to the snow. We did get snow, but it blowed so much that it would drift. And the pictures here, it had drifted just right so that the snow was compact enough that we could cut it into blocks and make this little igloo. I remember making this for the kids, for my younger brothers and sisters. And I think David helped me and Mark, but I remember thinking back on it that I built this for the little kids, but I'm sure everybody else helped build it. But I wanted to share one little incident that happened in the winter. Actually two. And one of those, it was, we lived about 8 miles out in the country from where we went to church. And one Saturday night it was snowing really hard and drifting, of course. Those roads drifted so bad. But that, you know, Dad said to Mom, he says, you know what, Lenore, I don't think we better plan on going to church tomorrow. With this weather, I don't think we'll make it. Well, the next morning, Mom gets up and walks out, and there stands Dad in his shirt and tie and suit on. And she says, where do you think you're going? And Dad just kind of chuckled and smiled. He says, oh, I can't stay home from church. And Mom says, well, you're not going without me, that's for sure. And so she scurried around and got all the kids up, and within just a few minutes got us all dressed and ready for church. And we went to church that Sunday in spite of the snow. Well, it was. I'm not even sure if it was that same year, but on another occasion, at that time we had separated meetings. We had sacrament, Sunday school and priesthood meeting in the morning, and then we'd go back in the evening about 6 o'clock for a sacrament meeting. So we had Sunday school, priesthood relief society in the morning, and sacrament meeting in the evening. So we were driving the car at the time, and it was snowing and it was blowing a little bit when we left for church to go back in for the evening sacrament meeting. Well, while we were in sacrament meeting, it really started to snow, and the wind howled, and it drifted the roads almost solid. I mean, I'm talking 2 and 3 foot drifts that blew up there within just a couple of hours. And so we're, all of us from the ward, when sacrament meeting's over, we're headed home. And about a mile south of the mile that we lived on, the drifts were really bad. And there were about 8 or 10 of us kind of in a line making our way home from church. And every one of those cars got stuck in that drifted snow. You know, they're within maybe 50 yards of each other, lined out there, 10 or 12 cars long. And so we're all out of the cars and got our heavy coats and stuff on. We trying to shovel out between each car and trying to kick the snow out of the way and trying to push each other out of the snow. We're out there working for probably half hour, 45 minutes. Then it's starting to get dark. And pretty soon, off in the distance, from about 3 different directions, we noticed 3 farm tractors come out of the farmyards and start headed for the highway. And it was our neighbors, our non-Mormon neighbors. And they had, all 3 of those guys had gotten their tractors and come down to the road to pull out all of those silly Mormons who were stuck in the snow trying to get home from church. I've laughed about that for years, how funny it was, and you know how much those guys on those tractors must have laughed at the Mormons. But we had good neighbors. They were just good neighbors, good people, um, and but they came out and rescued us that day, pulled us all out of the snow and helped us get home. That was a neat experience that I remember. So I see these pictures of harvest time, Dad with the grain harvester, and I remember I loved harvest time. I did not like grain harvest nearly as much as I liked the potato harvest. Uh, Grain harvest was so dusty and was hard on allergies. Although I didn't have a lot of allergies, but Dad did. Dad had problems with the grain dust. But the problem was, as I mentioned earlier, the couple of years there where Dad lost his crops to the weather, to early winter and fall rains, and so it always became kind of an urgent matter when it was time for the crops to be brought in, and the memory of having lost those crops earlier in his life weighed really heavy, not just on Dad, but on us kids as well, the whole family. And so harvest time was an urgent time. When the crops were ripe and ready to harvest, you harvested them, and you didn't stop for anything to get the crops in, except Sunday. Dad never harvested his crops on Sunday, which was not lost on me or any of the other kids. We did not do that on Sunday. But there, at that time, in the 60s, the steak that we were in there had a steak farm where they raised potatoes and sugar beets and grain. And Dad got a call from the steak one time asking him if he would go help harvest the steak grain, the Lord's grain. And I remember we're in the middle of the harvest, and so the feeling of wanting to get our crops in was very palpable. And I remember Dad not saying hardly anything. He just says, we're going to go over to the steak farm and harvest grain. Well, he pulled his harvester and trucks and everything out of his fields and moved them over to the steak farm to harvest the Lord's grain. And that, to me, the older I got, the more I look back on that, it was such a demonstration of faith on Dad's part, that he was willing to go over and harvest the Lord's crops before he even finished harvesting his own. And that lesson was not lost on me or my brothers or my sisters, for that matter. I mean, we knew what he was doing, and and I remember feeling really good that he would do that, to pull his harvester, move his whole operation over to the steak farm for 2 or 3 days. We were there 2 or 3 days, and in the fall, with potential bad weather moving through, 2 or 3 days could mean the difference between getting a crop in and not getting a crop in. But that was very meaningful to me that Dad would do that. this is another little story I wanted to tell, basically for my dad. In 1972, Mom and Dad went to Hawaii with some dear friends of theirs. They're members of the ward, and neighbors, farmers that Dad worked with a lot. Brother Gillette, L.A. Gillette, Glenn Hawks, and Brother Egbert. The Egberts, I can't remember Brother Egbert's first name, but the Egberts, and they were all friends to the folks, and they all got together this one year and went to Hawaii. While they were there, one day while they were there, the guys left their wives in the hotels or whatever, but they took a day and went out deep sea fishing. Now, you have to understand, these three guys were all avid sportsmen, hunters, fishermen, and they, all three of them. And they were a little bit competitive with each other. And so when they were out fishing and Dad caught this huge tuna, it kind of stuck in the other guy's craw just a little bit. You know, they all were just a little bit jealous of Dad that he had caught that big old tuna, and they had only caught those little, you know, the little barracuda, which by all rights were good sized fish in themselves, but they didn't catch the tuna. And I think it really tickled Dad a lot to think that he had caught that tuna and they had not. Well, it was on this same trip that Brother L.A. Gillette, he's the one here on the right in this picture, they were all playing in the surf on the beach. And Mom told me this later. She said, but a big old wave came in and just engulfed Brother Gillette, picked him up and slammed him down into the sand. And she says he came up spitting sand in his nose and in his eyes. And when he was spitting out the sand, he spit out his dentures. And she said he scrambled to try and catch those dentures, but he wasn't fast enough, and the receding surf and the riptide grabbed those dentures and pulled them right out to sea. And poor L.A. Gillette spent the rest of their Hawaiian vacation without any teeth. Can you imagine? Without any teeth. I've laughed at that 100 times, and I think Mom and Dad got a chuckle out of that as well. Felt bad for him, of course, but you can't help but chuckle over something like that. I just have to make a couple of closing comments here as I bring this editing of these videos to a close. I have thought so many times over the years, how in the world can you ever thank your Father in heaven enough for allowing you to be born into a family like we were born into? And I mentioned at the beginning of the film this, I always considered my childhood and those early years at home as being absolutely idyllic. Idyllic. Could not have been a more favored family that I know of in the whole world. To be born into a family where mother and father loved each other like they did, absolutely devoted to each other. They loved each other to death, and we knew it. There was no doubt in our minds that Mom and Dad absolutely loved each other. And they were devoted not just to each other, but they were devoted to us, their children. It took me a few years to recognize how much my dad really loved me. And he softened. He was a little more stern in his younger years, but he softened a lot towards the end of his life. Even when I was still at home, he had softened a lot. But, and Mom, she kind of calmed the waters for me several times by letting me know how much my dad loved me and how much I meant to him. But we saw that love between them as our parents. We saw that every day of our lives, how much they loved each other and how much they loved us. Our parents, Mom and Dad, as well as our grandparents and great-grandparents before us, left us such a wonderful legacy of love, of family, of devotion, and not just that, but also a deep, abiding love in the Savior, in our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. There was no doubt in my mind how much they loved the Lord and how much they desired themselves to be obedient to the commandments and to follow the counsel of the prophet. That love that they had permeated our house 24 hours a day, it was always there. And I will be, and I know my siblings will be eternally grateful for having had the blessing of living in such a wonderful home with such wonderful parents. Thank you, Mom and Dad. I love you.